In this video, I want to consolidate our understanding of complementary routing. I know some of these concepts can seem quite difficult. They're designed to make things easy and help us understand things in a clearer manner. So it's not helpful if they become even more confusing. So I'll spend a little bit of time talking about complementary routing, and it's not really a difficult concept. It's the kind of thing that's used in other martial arts. But before I talk about that, I want us to remember our key idea that techniques are ultimately superficial, or that's the translation of the term that we very often get from Wang Shangjai. But remember, superficial doesn't mean trivial. It doesn't mean that somehow we can just simply, for example, do standing and then something will happen to us and we'll be able to do techniques. It doesn't work like that. And Wang Shangjai's student Han Yiquan talks about this idea. I'll talk about it in more detail another time. But he says that we need our techniques to be the best that they can possibly be. We need to really think about these, and they need to be professionalized, just like every other part of Yiquan. So it becomes a whole field in itself that we need to explore and think about. And one of the really important things about that is that a body needs to be an expression of intent. I don't want to go too far into it in this video, because I want to talk in another video about why maybe some people haven't really been able to express their Yiquan in a level that necessarily made them competent enough when it came to fight capability. We can think about something Guo Yunshen, Wang Shangjai's teacher, said, that postures are just contrivances. They're just momentary crystallizations of intent. But nevertheless, the statement is misleading if it makes you think that somehow the mind will just be able to do the right thing. As I've explained before, this isn't innate. Those postures that you need, those training postures, are not just somehow in your DNA that you can just access from standing. It doesn't work like that at all. That crystallized form, that contrivance, as Guo Yunshen calls it, the momentary crystallization of intent into a posture, has to crystallize that intent into a posture that is the right posture, that it's in accordance with the laws of science. And I also think that's a really important point, that when we talk about Yiquan being scientific, we generally associate that with, it's not going to get too involved with ideas that Wang Shangjai and others called superstitious or felt to be superstitious. But actually it means something much deeper than that the whole practice should be scientific, that the postures that we use should follow the principles and laws of science. And that doesn't just mean that they're not relying on some kind of magical power. It means that the way that they link together, we need to think about, and we need to explore and think about how structural movement works in harmony with the laws of physics. And that's going to be very important as we begin to explain this really key idea of complementary routing. So let's begin with our basic posture like this. We're going to begin with the idea of a jab. So I'm not going to go through how to do it because we've already looked at that in a video. So we begin with a jab, and then we're going to change into a cross like this. And this is our first example of complementary routing. Let's just explore that a little bit to understand what I'm saying here. So the first thing we need to think about is that one of the essential components of Yiquan is Fa Li, the idea of explosive force. And all that means is mass times speed, and then the power that's generated through that mass times speed is transmitted through a structure, and that structure has got to be the right consistency, what we call a configuration, or in the old language a constellation, the right configuration of relaxation and tension to transmit the force to the right point, and the use of routing to make sure that that energy isn't dissipated. That's all it is. And like all wonderful things that are in harmony with the Tao, it's that simple, but it's also that complex. Now, there are different ways of using Fa Li. So the one that we're looking at the moment, the one that we're mostly emphasising, is the one where we turn round our axis, around our centre line. So we're turning to generate Fa Li, we're turning short movement around the centre line, and that's different, for example, to the kind where we move forwards that we've looked at before. So we've explained that, you know, this kind of old style punch, that doesn't generate Fa Li in the same way, for example, as this kind of jab. There's the moving forwards energy Fa Li, or even backwards, and then there's the round the axis Fa Li. Now the axis, the idea of an axis or a centre line, is really critical here. It begins to help us understand something about the sophistication of this paradigm, because we don't mean the spine. And I know it intuitively and also in terms of some of the material that's put out, for example, around Tai Chi and Yiquan, Bagua, there's a tendency to think about power generation from the spine. And when you think about it, that's quite an odd, like there's ways in which the spine can contribute to power generation. So for example, if you do this kind of movement, obviously it's using the spine, and the spine is obviously very important for controlling to some degree the movement of the core, but it's not that significant compared to, say, for example, the muscles around the body that move the body like that. So the spine plays a varying role, but this is nothing to do with that. This is to do with a centerline, and by that what we mean is you kind of got to get your head around this concept that the centerline doesn't really exist as such until it's created by movement. In a way, it's very much like Zhanzhuang, in that you hold the Tao. You know, this ancient idea that you hold Tao, you create this sense of there being something present out of nothing, just through your intent. It's very much an idea like that the centerline manifests itself when you move. And what we mean by that is we can think about, first of all, just imagine that there's a centerline going through the body. We'll pretend that it's that simple for the moment. And then we're going to move and release force fast round the centre line. We're going to do Farley, for example, with a jab like that. A short, sharp movement, and the power directed towards the jab. Now, the interesting laws of physics that we're working with here is, of course, these muscles, particularly around the core, get the movement generated. They make the movement happen. But then something different happens, that everything around the centerline point becomes like a counterweight around it. So it's moving very fast around it, like that. And that configuration of our body determines exactly where the centerline is in our body. It's just like a fairly simple law of physics. Just like if you got two weights tied to a stick and you spun them round like that, and they go around like that, and they act as counterweights and they spin the stick round. Only in this case, there isn't a stick. That stick is kind of created. It's a different kind of, sure, there's different experiments you can do when you're holding a wheel and stuff like that, and you can create the point where the centrifugal force is moving around when it didn't exist before. So that centerline, when we do that, just because of the laws of physics itself, that's a calculation based on our body mass and our body structure. So it's not going to be in the spine. It's going to, the law of physics that we're going to bring into play is going to try and find the average. Again, the doctrine of the mean, the most significant Chinese philosophy principle of all, the one that Wang Xiangjia emphasizes all the time, the doctrine of the mean. The body itself, just the laws of physics and the way that we move the body, is going to determine where that center line is. And that's going to be the averaging out of all the physical mass that's in motion. So that's not the spine. In fact, it's in front of the spine, obviously, because the spine is at the back and you've got weight at the back and you've got weight at the front. So it's going to be somewhere down the middle of the body. And that's going to change if you carry more weight up front, if the bosom is adding weight. So that's quite a complex calculation that's got to be made. And one of the reasons that we're doing that is that our posture is going to aid Fa-Li. So the idea is that we're going to aid Fa-Li. We're going to help it function. We're going to help this principle of the center line. We want to move fast, short, sharp movement round our axis, not round our spine. So these Chinese concepts from the past, like, you know, the Ming men and things like that, things about the spine, they don't come into play here at all. This isn't the principle that we're talking about. We want to issue force, we want to issue Fa-Li, and we want to aid that process. So actually the center line isn't real at all. And we're going to create this entire effect just from the way that we use our body. Fa-Li isn't some magic force that just comes out of nowhere. This is so much more profound, because all of this is an expression of intent. All of this is what this supercomputer of intent has to process and make happen to make each one work. What we want to do is aid the Farley to provide the right movement of these counterweights around the centre line to add as much possible force to the Farley. Whether it's this way or this way, all those, the principle is exactly the same, whether you're turning around your spine or whether you're moving forwards or backwards like that. You want to use the body to create and help Farley as much as possible, to add as much as possible to it. That idea is going to get even more sophisticated later on, believe me, when we start adding in relaxing the shoulders and the way that that works and the way that that functions and the way that we release force one way and then want to change another way and so on. But we're not going to talk about that today, just keep it in mind. So, creating the centre line through the short, sharp movement, and then the intent, calculating how this functions. And think about this important idea of the intent. It's not just brain. How primitive that idea is. Just when you say, oh, the brain does it. No, it's something far more than that. It's will. Just in the right moment, without even thinking about it, you can just, your will is applied to the movement, and it creates just the exact perfect within reason. As Yiquan says, Wangshan Jai student Yiquan says, perfect's just like an ideal that we kind of keep in mind, but as near as possible to the perfect possible distribution of weight to add force to the shifting round the axis that we create through that very process. That's such a sophisticated ask, and it's not even beginning to be like, that's 10%, 5, maybe even 1% of what we need the intention to do. That's already an incredibly sophisticated thing to calculate and to vary depending on posture and then where we are and then movement and then adding in with other movements. All of a sudden this becomes such an unbelievably complicated calculation that the intent has to make, that we start realising the genius of this thing, that intent floods and becomes the whole body comes alive with intent. And this is one of the things that makes this happen. Then calculating the exact type of body consistency, and then all the other things that intent also includes, like your courage and your will in the fight and your determination and your timing and your reactions. This thing Wangshan Jai talks about, you're imagining like you're a giant. All of these things that come together to make each one a functioning system as an actual martial art. A lot of that's too much for what we need right now, so we can start to begin to think about that. That we start with the jab, and this is just what we're doing with the jab. We're making this calculation to use the counterweight of the body around the centre line that forms as we do the posture. That's a really sophisticated. Oh, right in the nuts, mate. I'm not ignoring you. Only just been out. It's actually quite a sophisticated calculation when you think about it. When you can get it, it's the simplest thing in the world. But when you think about it, it's such a sophisticated task to do. So we're going to do remember we lift up on the foot. So remember, we want to look at our complementary routing. And what we're going to do here is drop, and then up again into the cross. And the back foot comes up. So we're going to go 1, down, and then up like that. 1, 2, 1, 2. Now this is exactly the same thing. This is the intent, thinking about how it uses the body like as a counterweight around this imaginary centre line. This imaginary centre line is now shifting as well, so it's an extra calculation. 1, and then this drop, and the swoop into the, it's like a swooping movement, very much like this posture that you see in Chan Chuan and Tai Chi. 1, 2, and it just adds a little bit of, so look, the swoop forward, not just the move forward, you can do it straight like that, but remember, our idea is that within the reality of the context of the fight, we want to end the fight as soon as we possibly can. So we want to hit as hard as we possibly can. We want to get as much power into every movement as we possibly can. Of course, we're making compromises with defence, and we're not going to do something stupid and overreach and get knocked out by throwing a wild movement that might be really, really powerful, but it's not good defensively. That's not what we're thinking. We're thinking within our tactical rules and our quintessence principles, we want to generate as much power as we possibly can. Like, don't waste time if you can hit with full power. So that's what we're trying to do. Hit with absolute full contact power, otherwise do something else. So 1, we want to add in every possible little ounce of extra force that we can. So instead of just going straight like that, 1, we drop, and we just get this little bit of slingshot coming up like that. 1, 2, like that. And we want that going upwards energy as well, because we want to hit and we want to knock the head back rather than just back like that. And in theory, there's a few reasons for doing that. One is that usually in Yiquan for self-defense, we don't want to punch the face. And this is the social construction of violence. Like, you think like, well, if you're going to throw a punch to the head, you're going to punch the face, right? No, you want to punch right in the throat, right in the classic Yiquan throat punch. Like, no, you know, if it's serious enough that you need to punch someone, then don't. The idea is you don't mess around if it's life or death. And if it is, into the throat. So we're lifting up like this into the throat like this, or even like this if you like, the old school up into the throat. But we also, if we can get the head pushed up and back, the idea is it will maybe just have a little bit of an advantage in terms of making people move back. So this idea that in each one we want to unbalance people, get them off their route, and then when we hit them again, it'll have more of an effect. So we put this little swoop in, 1, 2 into it like that, 1, 2. Also helps to move the head a little bit. 1, it's not a massive consideration, but it just helps to move the head a little bit. Don't overdo it unless, don't overdo it like this unless you really need to, like, unless there's a reason for doing it like that, you're avoiding something. 1, 2, so the head is moving a little bit and it's moving up and down like that. And look at the feet, 1, 2, 1, 2. So it's not just changing from one to the other, the change itself is part of the process of adding force. So even though it's 2 techniques, 1, 2, we can say now it's become a technique on its own. The jab cross, it's a whole thing. 1, 2, it's got its own logic. Extension, it's an extension of the jab, it's an extension of the cross, but it's got its own logic as a technique in itself. 1, 2, the other way, 1, 2. Now we can see one of the really interesting things about this kind of Yiquan jab, where you actually move back like that rather than in like that. You can do exactly the same thing. We can call this complementary routing as well in a way. 1, 2, 1, 2. And in a way that becomes a thing in and of itself, but I think not in quite the same way. The kind of boxing jab cross, 1, 2. To my mind, it remains 2 separate techniques, but they're put together into a combination. This is something else. It's the nature of the routing itself. The posture itself is then complementary to adding force to the next posture. With this 1, 2 swoop force. So you see now we're getting more of the body weight into the punch. So body weight is very often confused with whole body power by people who don't really understand whole body power. But body weight power isn't the same thing. This is body weight power like that, where you do that, you can lean in and step in like that. This is a different thing. Whole body power, talk about that another time, it's a different thing. 1, but here we do add in body weight. 2, and here we don't, because we're going backwards. We're adding in mass into the mass times speed equation in the way that we use Farley, generating force around our axis. 1, so we're still using mass, but and that's still body weight, but it's not using this 1, 2 momentum and body weight like this 1, 2 moving forward. So when we do this again, we're using mass to go around the axis like that, but we're also leaning forward and adding body weight in. So to me, that's more scientific. That's a more scientific way of doing the jab cross. There might be other considerations that say in the reality of the fight, you shouldn't do it like that. So for one thing, it can be quite a big 1, 2, it can be quite a big movement. It's such a big movement. So one of the things that we want to do on a more advanced level is speed that movement up, bridge that gap between structural movement and speed. I'm just flagging that up now so that I'm making it clear that is possible. And it's what I do, really. Every time that I do back work, I'm doing that, I'm bridging that gap between big structural movement and making it faster. So at first it might seem slower because it's a bigger movement than 1, 2, like that. It's 1, 2, it's a bigger movement, but you can bridge that and you can make it faster, and we'll talk about how to do that another time. Other than that, to me, it's a more scientific way of doing this punch. So when people say Chinese wushu doesn't work, and there's all these excuses around it, well, that works. That clearly works. That's clearly a scientific and mechanically sound punching concept, and it does the business and generates force when it's done right. So you can go and look at the way I do it and the way I hit the bag, hit like a piston, hit with power, and you can see this works. This generates real power. Now, having said all that, when we want to come back from the cross to the jab, we very often don't want to drop and do that. That is too slow. One, it's just in the nature of this movement. The foot's got to go down anyway, so we may as well just go with the swoop and get the momentum. But when we go this way, this foot's got to come up. So we don't really want to drop and then come up, because then we start losing our speed aspect. We don't want to go too far into that. Here, one, instead of going down and swooping backwards and up, one, unless we need to, unless it's like we're deliberately moving out of the way like that, something like that, those are all perfectly legitimate techniques, but they're advanced. So now, for now, we just want the basic form. We go one, and we just go straight back into the punch like that. So we cut out that little swoop that we have initially when we do the one, and then we do 1, 2 like that. Straight back into the fast jab. So 1, 2, 3. Straight back like that into the fast movement. So we start from there, and again, look at the movement. This is the complementary routing. It doesn't just move from one to the other. The movement from one to the other favours this kind of movement, like one favours it, and it adds power to it. So this idea of favouring the movement. So these concepts that we're using, like for example, structural sympathy and complementary routing, these aren't completely isolated concepts. They overlap and interconnect. So this is a little bit like the idea of structural sympathy, that the movement favours this movement. So, or at least on a simple level. So 1, 2. If we want to do something different, let's say from here, I want to step out and throw a punch like that. That's perfectly doable within the structural paradigm. And that's what we call the structural symmetry, that it all links together like Lego bricks, and you can do that. But the complementary routing for speed just suggests that, like it favours that more than that. That's a slightly more difficult movement. And that's really the best way to think about complementary routing and structural sympathy, like that some things are just favoured naturally than others. Some things are more difficult than others from that position. And this is one, to go out like that, or to go 1, 2, you know, with this kind of stop, start punch or stutter punch, using quarter routing from the rear pivot route. Those are advanced concepts. So complementary routing is a really basic skill that we get quite early on. So from here, 1, 1, 2, it just favours. Just pull back, and it just favours this posture. And critically, it favours the turning around the axis. It favours the generation of power through far leg. 1, 2. It's a really simple move. 1, 2. It's not just changing from one posture to the other. It's adding into the force of the punch. So that's what we call complementary routing. So of course, like everything, it's not quite that simple, you know. So there's different variations. Remember when I talked about task-specific variations. So if we think about this posture, 1, 2, and we can even add in 3 and then reset. So 1, 2, 3, and practice like this. 1, 2, 3, change. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Practice like that. One of the things that's happening there is the energy release is very linear. So it's going straight forward like that. And remember when I talked about the difference between a jab and a hook with the routing, and look how the the jab, lead leg, root, and the hook are different. So for the jab, it only comes up about a quarter of the way and then comes up further for the hook. So remember, I talked about to allow the body to turn like that. With a jab, it's moving that far. The body is moving like that far, so it remains quite flat on. And then with the hook, it moves more like that. So it's going round more. That's a rounder use of the whole body to generate force around the centre line. So quite linear, 1, 2, 3. Then we change that to hook, 1, 2, 3. Now the use of this counterweight around the centre line to generate Farley is different and it's harder. It's going further, 1, 2, 3. And also, one of the principles that this is teaching us is the way that structures are strong, the way that they're weak, the way that they're strong and the way that they're rooted. Something that, for example, is really critical when we do push hands and we're thinking about, or even when we're just sparring and we want to push someone, we're thinking about where are they strong and where are they weak. This is your strongest, your strongest axis, if you like, forward and back like that. And this is your weak. Someone can just push you over with a punch. It takes nothing to push you that way. So this is partly teaching us about where we're strong. So again, this is like an integrated pedagogy. So you think you're learning one thing, but you're learning something very sophisticated about something else. In this case, when we do this, 1, 2, 3, we can balance this really well because all the energy is just kind of flat forward. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. It's just flat forward. But when we go 1, 2, 3, that's harder to balance because now we've got energy going one way or the other. And I just mean real kinetic energy. So I just mean kinetic energy. So 1, and if you do like that with power, holding your balance is a lot harder than it looks. And this again is the incredible sophistication of intent. And I'll talk about in the next video how this idea has kind of been manipulated so that for a lot of people it's only ever applied to training before you do techniques. No, it's about flooding the whole body with intent, and the way the intent works as a supercomputer to control your movement. Incredibly sophisticated idea. So this is one of the things, as well as calculating all of this around the axis and the movement and the posture and the reality of the fight and everything, it's also got to think about your balance. So 1, so we'll do lead hook, and then into the back hook. It's very much the same thing as the jab. So 1, 2, and this is our structural symmetry. It's the same. It's just slightly different. It just needs the intent to make a slight difference. And remember, one of the things that I talked about here, and Yiquan also talks about this, that to make it easier for the intent to do all these calculations and to be effective, we want the techniques to be as correct as possible for the general principle, and we want as many transferable skills between techniques as possible. So we want a set of techniques. Okay, they're intuitively used and deployed, but they follow a set of rules that applies pretty much across the board, 95% across the board. So learn one thing and it helps you do 50 other things. This makes it far easier for the intent to use this really very sophisticated martial arts paradigm. So it's very much like, for example, it's very much like the jab 1, but we're just going to turn a little bit more with it. And we're going to sweep in just the same way and throw the hook out to the centre line. And we need to balance it. 1, 2, like that. 1, 2, 1, 2. So it's the same, but the challenge for the balance is different. As you start bringing power into it, then you'll see. As you start 1, like that, and stopping at the centre line, as well as all the shearing forces in your body that you've got to control, which is another thing that the intent has got to control, because you can't just stop like that dead. That energy then rebounds through the body, and this is one of the reasons why you've got to practice it on the air, not just on the bag. Like sometimes people say, well, why practice it on the air? That's not functional, that's like something from the Stone Age. It's like something like forms practicing on the air. the air doesn't fight back, and that's a legitimate criticism for people who are always posting videos of themselves doing jam move and saying like, you know, this is great Yiquan or something like that. Everyone's great fighting the air, but no, this isn't Stone Age. This is a very sophisticated idea that when you do it with real force, your intent's got to control all those shearing forces, and particularly if you miss or you don't make the full contact order. Again, as Yiquan says, we're talking about perfect examples and then kind of working back from them. So the perfect examples, we hit and all the force possible that our body can generate is transmitted into that one punch. But in reality, it's almost certainly not going to be like that. But it's not always going to be perfect. It's not always going to be perfect. So sometimes you might only hit, you know, you might just catch them. And so, you know, like this part of your hand hits and the rest of the force goes past, like something like that. That kind of thing that happens all the time. And recognising that. And we need our body to be able to control this power. So you might miss, you might just catch it a little bit. They might move in and add force to it. So that's as Zhao Daoxin says, that's the other thing that can happen. You could hit with absolute full force and they could be moving in, and that could add even more force to it. So that creates another thing that the intent has got to manage. See what we're doing here? We're taking it out of this kind of Western dichotomized paradigm where you might say, oh, that's something the body's got to, you know, your form or your body or, you know, even your structure's got to be able to absorb that. And we're saying, no, actually, that's intense that does that. Body can't do that on its own. It's the programming, the will. Say programming, but that's kind of dead, isn't it? But this is will. It's alive. It's animating your body and making it function. That's got to make those decisions, not the body. The body just needs to be able to do them and have the strength to do them. So for that reason, we need to practice on the air, and not always. Don't have to be always full power, but we need to be able to challenge the body to make adjustments to correct the balance. See what I did then? Like it was just going to overbalance a little bit and I moved my foot a little bit. Things like that just become intuitive. Like, you know, like I didn't do that deliberately. Not sure whether that picked up on the camera or not, but my foot just went out a little bit because I just went over a little bit too much. We just adapted. So things like that, you know. There's a saying in Eagle Claw, when an eagle tumbles, it tumbles like an eagle. So like, it's not about making mistakes, it's about adapting within your paradigm. Again, from there, so one, and swoop in, and then the other way, 1, 2, and then reset. 1, 2, reset. 1, 2, reset, and change. 1, 2, reset. 1, 2, reset. 1, 2, reset, and just practice like that. Remember what I said, this is intuitive but not innate. You create intuitive ability by diligent practice, and the more you practice intelligently, the more your intuition will be able to take over and do the right thing. So a diligent student's thinking now, well, yeah, well, intent is even more sophisticated, isn't it? Because you very often don't do that 1, 2, 3. In fact, it's a very old-fashioned way of training that was practicing Yiquan in the past. And I still do it, and I still teach like 1, 2, 3. That's why I'm recommending it now. But you will very often never see people go beyond that. In other videos, I've talked about the fight level in the 1980s and the kind of drills and fight practice that people were doing. We could say that the kind of drills that they then practice 1, 2, 3, they're too basic. So we want to think about practicing punches in different kinds of combinations. That should be obvious. But that also applies to all of this stuff that we've been talking about. Because look, if we go 1, this is this kind of much straighter balance. So there's the jab, 1, and then I'm going to swoop into the hook. So then this way I'm turning that far on my axis, or yay far, and that way I'm turning that far further on my axis. So that's about what? A quarter, and that's about a third. So 1, and then 2. So they're different. Each side is different. The way I'm going to is different, the way it's balanced is different, and the way the movement from one into the other is different from 1, 2. So this is structural symmetry, but it's also adaptation within the structural symmetry. It's task-specific adaptation within broad movements that are 90% similar. And again, it's still complementary routing. One goes into the next. 1, 2, and 1. Say for example, like an example of non-complementary routing is 1, and then I want to step back with this 1, 2, like that. That's non-complementary. Still structural symmetry, but it's a more difficult. For a split second, I've got to go like that. I've got to do quite an awkward movement, like 1, 2, like that. Just for a split second, leaves me 1. It's perfectly valid. It's perfectly within the Lego piece structural paradigm, but it doesn't have quite the same sympathy between the routing. It's a very basic skill. It's like tier one of routing. 1. So where was I? 1, yeah, and then into the hook this way or this way. 1, and then turn over more for the hook. 1, and you can also generate a little bit more force because there's just a tiny bit more that you can get around into the punch. And look, this is just the muscles of the body. Imagine like 2 weights. Think about the shoulders particularly, because we'll come back to that, as going round the axis. And look here, you can see here, for example, hopefully see here, my axis isn't my spine. My axis is going right down through it. Come through right at the bottom. I believe this area is called the gooch. The gooch between your anus and your genitals. From the gooch, I learned that from a skateboarding video. So apparently this is something that happens. The skateboard flips up into your gooch, and it goes up through the body and through the head. And think about how many times you've heard about that in Tai Chi and Yiquan, the idea of like a rope on your head suspending your head, and now you've been saying, right, I get it. 1, 2, like that. That's where the axis is. 1, 2, turn around the axis. And using to generate force, using the spin round of the weights of the body. And think about these as 2 weights, because these are the 2 extremities. 1, 2. There's a little bit more to it than that, but I'm going to come back to that. Remember, I talked about relaxing these muscles and using them in a shimmy. I'm going to come back to that another time. And hitting round like this. 1, 2. 1, 2. Start relaxed like this. 1, swoop into it. Now let's say from here we want to practice those, by the way, 4 times, 8 times each way. You can start think of all the other techniques that we've looked at, and maybe do a few today. 1, 2. So let's now start from the hook, and let's say if we want to pull back into the jab, that's pretty much exactly the same principle as when we pull back from the cross. It's just that the body is round a little bit more, so there's a bit more round pulling back, whereas before it was a little bit more straight back like that one. It's a little bit more round. These are all, as a learning pedagogy, you learn it by doing it and feeling it. 1, 2, from here, just goes round a little bit more, and then into this straighter, 1, 2, this straighter punch. But let's say we want to go into a hook. So 1 from here, and we want to go back into the hook. This is a slightly more difficult movement, because with the jab you can just go straight back like that. But to go round, that's more like with the straight back, you can just push back from your root like that. From the cross to the jab, you can just push back on your leg like that from the root. But you can't do this with the hook. You've got to turn, you've got to use the side muscles to turn you round a little bit more like that. 1, 2. So it's the same but different. So these are all, remember in the previous video I said, they're task-specific variations. It's slightly different. You'll feel them all intuitively when you do them. It's just understanding the genius of the system. 1, 2. The most important thing to get across is, yeah, okay, techniques are superficial. They're not trivial. And this process of the intense controlling, of filling the body, of flooding the whole body and controlling all of these things, making these micro adjustments, And then even just doing them on the pads and making the micro adjustments on the pad, boom, 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 on the pads, and then bringing it into fight. Then when it be looked in the face, attacked by a dog, you've got to make all these micro adjustments, footwork, and be very careful with the dog at all times, aren't we? You being the most important thing of all. And the intent has got to do all these things. And also the intent has got to take the dog out for a walk. We'll do that in a moment. So let's just look at a few different variations then. You can kind of practice them on your own. Just wait a minute. So from the things that we've done before. So lead hand chopping up uppercut like this, and then down into the backhand planting fist. And now you can see straight away there's a different task specific variation. The routing is still complementary, it's completely complementary, but it's doing something slightly different. Remember, Wushu is open, close, up and down. And remember we said this is up, and this is down. This sinking the chi, the drop routing, what we call drop routing. 1, 2. It's got this kind of springy feel to it. When people are good at each one, you can always see this kind of springy movement from the qua and the core. 1 up and then down. 1, 2, and you can go back like that again, straight back. And then a little bit more advanced. Remember, I said put this drop of the shoulder in. So you can see it. You can see the shoulder. When I look back on the video, you can see it. You can see the shoulder move first, like that. And all this is completely complementary routing. It's basic routing. It's just, you know, as far as this goes, Elvis could do that. You know, as far as that goes, it's like a dance move. It's not an exotic. It's not an exotic movement. It's a basic routing concept. Other way. 1, 2. And let's say we go 1, 2, and then we go jab. So this is up, down, and this, remember, is open. Up, down, close, open. That's our Wushu. Wushu is up, down, close, open. That's it. You get the manual. It says up, down, close, open. So up, down, and this is open because the chest opens like that. 1, 2, 3, open. Up, down, open. And we could do up, down, and then we could do elbow like that. That's closed. So 1, I know we've not looked at elbows yet. 1, 2, 3. Close. So see how with the elbow, this shoulder comes in. I don't go like that. It's perfectly valid, by the way. See the genius of structural movement. There's usually 2 ways, 2 or 3 ways of doing the same thing. So very often you've got to decide which is the best way, open or close. So is it open or is it close like that? Remember I talked about Yaozong's on teaching like this and bringing this hand in for a lot of postures, using close rather than open. Talk about that another time when we come to elbows, but we could do it like that for now. So 1, 2, 3 into the elbow, and that's also a good example of what I called structural sympathy. That the elbow from here, the elbow is a more sympathetic movement than, say, for example, pulling back into the hook. It just goes straight in. There's less time, there's less dead time. So you can think about structural sympathy like that. What's the posture that has the least dead time? So this has got to come back and go round. It's a little bit like a manchuan. This has just got to go straight in. Well, I think that's the one we did last time anyway, so it's a good example of structural sympathy. Some others are a little bit more difficult though. So again, uppercut uses up. Well, let's say we want to do the big overhand like that. Remember that I said it's very easy to off balance. So the complementary routing isn't as complementary. It's a little bit ruder, if you like. So go 1, and we can do it like that. Can do it like that, but we're a little bit more off balance. And this starts to suggest to us then that we need to make an adjustment. So we go 1 and then 2. We step out slightly with the 1, 2. is slightly less complementary, but we don't like complementary routing isn't a rule. It's just a word we use to help explain a really basic routing concept. It's not something we need to be fixed to. 1, 2, and just step out a little bit. And this now adds into the posture like that. Now we can call this a form of complementary routing, but it's complementary to the punch. It's not complementary from one to another. It's complementary to this technique, and it follows this Yiquan principle of the hand and the foot land together. So again, taking a concept and then expanding it, running with it, seeing it on different levels. This is going to be key to understanding each one. Seeing the same idea. Here's how someone sees it on the beginner level. And so many people are on that beginner level and think that they're, and you can always tell because they always think in really, not simple terms, simplistic terms. Up here is simple. Up here, where the Tao truly manifests itself, it's incredibly simple things that have the most profound implications. Down here is simplistic stuff, mono stuff, things where people say, this is this and it just means that and that's it. No. So, 1, step out. This also now is complementary routing. 1, but it just exists in a moment to be complementary to this particular punch. This 1, 2. And we can say that, for example, 1, 2 into the cross. This has a little bit more structural sympathy. It's easier to do, in other words. I mean, we could just say easier, but it doesn't quite get across that concept of the structural nature of the integration. That's got lots of structural sympathy. It just happens really, really easily. You've got to go up on another skill level to get this one. It's got less structural sympathy, but we can still call it a form of complementary routing, only we're changing that slightly. Now it complements the strike. 1, 2, that way, this way. 1, 2, that way. 1, 2. And as the idea then unfolds and becomes a little bit more sophisticated, we're going to see there's lots of ways that we use routing in a complementary fashion like that. But for now, we're just going to kind of take it this far. What other things did we do? We looked at the low 1, so we can say 1 and then 1. Another kind is to go straight into the uppercut. This one. So low 1 and then down like that, up. So before jab cross is just kind of like that. It's actually open, open. These are both open, by the way. Open, open, and then we can do whatever it was I was doing. 1 and then into the uppercut. Open, up, open. See, the energy dips and goes up. Open, open, up, like that. And again, you'll feel like this is weak in this direction, so it's also teaching you about your axes, your directional axes on which you're weakest and strongest. Emptier or fuller. One of the meanings of this idea is empty or full. This is quite empty that way, but it's quite full that way. So to practice them, just break them down into the individual. All those postures that we looked at, just think about 1, 2, because they're all slightly different. So that's up, up, that's open, open. Look at this. We can do it open, we can do it close, close, or we can do it, I always do it open like that, open. We can do it close like that, open, open, or close, close like that. Just think about, are the shoulders opening up like that, or are they going in like that? And just practice these different kinds of complementary routing. When we start to step with it, it goes on a whole other level again. I mean, I could go through all different possible variations, but actually you need to do that. You need to think like, right, I'm going to do jab, hook, uppercut, jab, hook, uppercut, jab, hook, uppercut. Do 4 either way. After you're quite comfortable doing 4 either way, and then think about loads of them. Think about loads of different, like, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And just think about Just from the punches that we've done already, there's thousands and thousands of different variations. But a really good tip is once you've done that and you're getting quite good at that, then change with each one. So you go 1, 2, 3, change. 1, 2, 3, change. 1, 2, 3, change. 1, 2, 3, change. Because then your brain's got to switch all the time between the different postures, and that trains your intent. Trains your intent to be more adaptive. You're like, oh, what's it this way? So working out the postures, doing them one way and then working them out the other way, trains your intent. It plays a really important role. First of all, just in working them out. If you can do it one way, doing it on the side that you favour less, of course that's training that side as well. But then doing them straight away, one after the other, 1, 2, 3, challenges your E to become superior in its functioning integration with the body. That's what we're going to look at next. That's what we're going to look at in the next video. We're going to go back to Zhanzhuang and we're going to look at some pretty interesting, sophisticated ways of thinking about Zhanzhuang. That's it for today. As ever, thanks very much for watching. Very much. One love. Take it easy. See you in the next one.